Okay, sports fans, we're gonna here talk about the Islamic Empire as it moved into India, and then just kind of a review again of the decline of the uh, Abbasid dynasty. We've discussed it before, but just to kind of put it in perspective. So you should have your worksheet out next to you with this information. You don't need to take notes per se, but you can follow along, and some of this information will be on the test. Okay, so um, as the Umayyad dynasty was spreading, right? We've talked about this before. They were coming up into Europe and now coming into India. And I'm sure this will come as a surprise for you, but Hinduism and Islam are very different. So I thought it might be interesting to kind of take a look at this chart here and ponder kind of what is different. I think there's some interesting things. I think Islam shares with Christianity and Judaism the monotheistic perspective. It's kind of one way or no way. On the other hand, Hinduism and I think even Buddhism in that sense are fairly open, right? However you get to the truth, you know, it's okay. But then here I think is something interesting, right? Even though they might have these strict belief systems, um, socially, Islam was highly egalitarian, right? Muhammad taught that people were equal before God. And we've talked about how in Hinduism they had a fairly strict caste system, social hierarchy, like we'll see in Europe, in Japan, and other areas. So you can see that in some instances there could be some common ground, but in others, maybe some clashing. Okay, so as I mentioned, in 711, the Umayyad dynasty launched an invasion of Western India, but at that point they just secured just a small area, which we'll look at a little bit later on the map, the Sindh, um, and back to our old friends, right, in the Indus Valley region. So initially, people welcomed the Muslim conquerors. They were hoping they liked the idea of lower taxes and some religious tolerance. We talked about how Jews and Christians were considered in the caliphates as people of the book, right? So they were allowed to practice their faith as long as they paid a tax. And so when the Muslims came in and found new religions, right, they realized they probably had to expand this definition of the people of the book. So even though the book is different, but they saw that they were also religious people. And then starting with this interaction, a lot of the Indian learning traveled back to Baghdad. Remember, we talked in class about Arabic numerals. Europeans call them Arabic numerals, but they really came from India, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, rather than the IX and IVs. And so math, science, music, a lot of these things would circle through, and the Muslims would make innovations of them and then eventually pass them on to other parts of the world. So by the 1020s, right, and so the Sindh is probably about here. So they're ready to kind of move further into India. And so Mahmud of Ghazni, right, started to lead a series of invasions. And from this point on, we'll look at 2 centuries of Muslim raiding and conquering in India. And here's a picture from a little bit later, from the 1300s, about one of these conquests. What are they looking for? What everyone's going to look for, from the Muslims at this period to Europeans in modern history. They were searching for riches and wealth. So the major thing we have to know here is this man, Muhammad of Gur. So he begins the beginnings of what will be called the Delhi Sultanate. And so this will last, as you can see, for several hundred years. And frankly, this begins a series of centuries of Islamic control of a Hindu India. When the British come to India in the 1700s, they will slowly take over the last of the Islamic empires there, the Mughals, which you'll learn about next year in history. So he brings northern India under Muslim control and establishes a capital in Delhi, and soon this will become the Delhi Sultanate. Um, and the next sultan, will secure official recognition as another Muslim state. So remember, you had kind of these offshoots in Umayyad in Spain, right? And now here in India. So here's the map. So this is about where the Sind is. And I put this map on your worksheet because I think it's pretty handy. So we see kind of the different movements of the Islamic Empire, right? So you can see at one point, right, by 1335, they had controlled large parts of India. But by the 1500s, their control had shrunk to just this area, and there is Delhi today. But you can see today, right, here is parts of Pakistan, right, all the way over here into Bangladesh. Okay, probably some of the most famous part of the Delhi Sultanate is the architecture. And so there's this, I'll let you pronounce that, complex built here beginning in the 1300s and then improved on and enlarged as the Islamic Empire grew. And so it was a complex. There's a mosque, a palace, a fortress, all kinds of things. But again, you can see the Arabic characters here as decoration. And this is kind of something interesting. This is the largest freestanding brick minaret in the world. Okay, so, and from this point on all the way to the Mughals in modern history, tolerance for Hindus generally remained, but we'll see throughout history this kind of comes and goes. Depending on the ruler, sometimes people got along okay and sometimes not. And some Indians began to convert to Islam. Not, remember, not necessarily by force, right? They weren't really seeking converts, but through their interaction, the people's interactions with merchants and the Sufis, who were the missionaries, if you will, of Islam, people slowly started to convert. And some Indians did see some common elements with their own religious beliefs. And the lower caste Hindus, right, definitely saw a better way of life, right, more, as we mentioned, egalitarian beliefs in Islam. And then the Buddhists also that were still around in India started to convert to Islam and eventually continue to that diminished presence of Buddhists in India. But generally, the bulk of the population will remain Hindu. And we talked, if you recall, from when we talked about classical India, as different ethnic groups came into India, most of them will, or probably all of them, except for the Muslims, will absorb the culture and become Hindus and blend in. But the Muslims never did. So, with this new religious force, a new group sort of within Hinduism called the Bhaktic cults began to kind of revive Hindu beliefs. And Bhaktic cults are dealing with kind of these personal relationships with God, dealing with the love of God. And so that kind of led to some standoffs between the two religions. So in the end, India remained, right, one of the least converted and integrated areas of the Muslim empire. And so this outside religion, ethnic group controlling India, like I said, will lead to tension throughout history and even in the 20th century. Okay, so just to review, this kind of first phase of the Islamic empires, the second phase will begin then in modern history in 10th grade history for you guys. So it ends with the Abbasids here as they reach their highest point there in India. So we've been talking about this for a while, right? The power starts to be challenged by the 10th and 11th centuries. They had a problem with succession. And then the Mongols, we've been talking a lot about under Genghis Khan, will raid and take over some of those Turco-Persian kingdoms east of Baghdad that the Abbasids didn't quite control completely. And Hulagu, Genghis Khan's grandson, he's the one who will eventually raid and sack Baghdad in 1258. Pretend that's what it says. And so the last caliph of the Abbasids, or of these Islamic empires, starting with the time of Muhammad, will be killed by the Mongols. And then, as we'll see in our next unit, and then next year, the Mongols then will be defeated by another group of nomads, are the Mamluks. Okay, enjoy.